Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. I received questions about what needs to be disclosed to the buyer or the seller, or both, when compensation that's received by one side of the transaction is shared with a broker on the other side of the transaction. This can happen in a variety of ways. The context of the question that I've received most often is this: I am a team member. My team leader represents the seller. My team leader is the listing broker. I represent the buyer. From my compensation, I must pay some portion to my team leader on every transaction, which means that when the buyer broker compensation is paid to me, the buyer broker, a portion of that compensation will be paid to the seller's broker, my team leader, who happens to be the listing agent in this transaction. Must I, as the buyer broker, disclose that I'm sharing some of my compensation from the buyer side of the transaction with the broker who's representing the seller? And the answer to that question is yes, unequivocally yes. And moreover, listing broker also has to make that disclosure to the seller. The disclosure must be made before either party. Well, buyer must make the disclosure to buyer. Buyer broker must make the disclosure to buyer before buyer signs an offer. Listing broker must make the disclosure to seller before seller accepts buyer's offer or signs a counteroffer. Let's give another scenario of how this might come up, and then we'll talk about how you make the disclosure. Another scenario where this comes up often: let's say I am the listing broker and I'm approached by an unrepresented buyer. And the unrepresented buyer says, I want to purchase this property. And I say to the buyer, great, I will help you, but I advise you to get your own representation because I represent the seller exclusively. You will be without representation unless you get representation. And this particular buyer says, I'd like that. I'd like to have representation. Can you refer somebody to me? And I say, sure, I'm going to refer you to my friend Jane Doe. Let's say Jane Doe is at another firm. And so then I pick up the phone, I call Jane Doe. Jane Doe says, yes, I'd be happy to work with this buyer. I say, Jane, will you pay me a referral fee? And Jane says, yes, I'll pay you a referral fee. We enter a written referral fee agreement. And now I, as the listing broker, am going to receive a referral fee from the buyer broker's compensation. One more scenario. Actually, let's leave it at that for now. And then I'm going to use one more scenario to help explain when you don't have to make this disclosure. So stand by for that one. So in either of these scenarios we've described, where you've got the team scenario where a team member has to share compensation with the team leader, or a referral has been made and compensation is going to be paid across the transaction to the referring broker, the disclosure must be made to both the buyer and the seller. Washington law says that you must disclose to your client any compensation offered by the firm or the party on the other side of the transaction. And that disclosure must be made before the party signs a contract. There is no specific form that you have to use. Now, as a side note, you should all be familiar with Form 21, paragraph 17A. That's the boilerplate provision that the statewide forms provide for you as the buyer broker to disclose that seller has offered compensation to your buyer. It's because of this provision of Washington law that we're discussing that you have to make that disclosure. And because that disclosure happens in so many transactions, it's built into the boilerplate language of Form 21. It is not commonplace in every transaction for a team member to compensate a team leader across the transaction. So there's no boilerplate provision for that. It's not commonplace for a buyer broker to share a referral fee with a listing firm in very many transactions. So that's not in the boilerplate language of the purchase and sale agreement either. And in fact, there are no boilerplate forms to make those disclosures. Instead, here is what I would recommend that you do. When you are the buyer broker, you're selling to your team leader's listing broker, or you are the referred buyer broker and you're going to pay a referral fee to the listing broker. When you are setting up your meeting to write the buyer's offer, in the email where you're scheduling that meeting, say to the buyer, dear buyer, talk about whatever it is you want to talk about in the email. Also mention, as we've previously discussed, and hopefully you have, I wanted to remind you that in this transaction, I will be paying some portion of my compensation earned to my team leader, who is the listing broker in this transaction. I will be paying some portion of my compensation to the listing firm that referred you to me as a buyer. So buyer, let me know what time you're available to come in tonight and sign your offer. Something like that. Now, is the buyer going to reply to that email? Yes, the buyer is going to reply to that email because they want to confirm the time that they're going to come in to meet with you. When the buyer replies to that email, you preserve a copy of their reply along with your email. So now you have proof that they received your email and your email makes that disclosure before they've signed an offer. You keep all of that material communication in your firm's transaction folder. From the listing side, whether you're the team leader listing broker or you're the listing broker who made the referral of the unrepresented buyer to another broker, in either case, it's our listing firm that's going to get paid compensation from the buyer broker side in this transaction. You do something similar. You email your seller earlier in the day and you say, good news, I think we have an offer coming in. I'd like to schedule a time that we can get together. I do want to tell you the little bit that I know about this buyer already. And here's one thing I know about them. They're represented by whomever it might be. And this buyer broker is obligated to pay a portion of their compensation to me in the amount of, and you're going to disclose that. What time would you be available for me to come over tonight to present the offer? Again, seller is going to reply to that email. They want to get that offer. And so when they reply, you preserve for your firm's transaction folder their reply, which proves their receipt of your disclosure that your firm will receive compensation from the buyer broker's firm. And with that, you will have satisfied Washington law. Now, what is the nature of the transaction that I was going to use to illustrate when you don't have to make this disclosure? Let me back up by giving you the basic rule. You have to disclose to your client that you're receiving compensation when compensation is being paid across the transaction. So buyer brokerage compensation is being paid to the listing firm, or listing firm compensation is being paid to the buyer brokerage firm. And sometimes those two brokers are in the same firm, as in the case of the team member and the team leader. You still have to make the disclosure. You do not have to make the disclosure if you and the broker who is paying or receiving the compensation is on the same side of the transaction as you. So for example, my team leader is my supervising managing broker. And so whoever I represent in the transaction, they also represent that same party. But they don't represent anybody else in this transaction. They're not involved in this transaction except as my supervising managing broker. And so I, as the buyer broker, will be paid compensation in this transaction, and I must share a portion of my compensation with my team leader, who also represents the buyer. Neither I nor my team leader am required to make a disclosure to the buyer or the seller that I'm sharing my compensation with a team leader who represents the same party in the transaction as I do. Or let's say that I am paying a referral fee to a broker in Arizona. Doesn't represent anybody in the transaction, but they referred the buyer to me. They're not getting, they don't represent the seller. They don't represent the buyer, or maybe they have represented the buyer in the past, but they've referred the buyer to me who's purchasing property in Washington state now, and I'm going to pay compensation to them. I am not required to disclose that I'm paying compensation to that broker in Arizona who does not represent the seller. That's the key. I have to make a disclosure if I'm compensating the broker on the other side of the transaction. I have to make a disclosure if I'm receiving compensation from the broker on the other side of the transaction. I do not have to make a disclosure if I am paying or receiving compensation on the same side of the transaction. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please ask me a question by visiting warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.